Philadelphia, December 19th, 1902. As she stepped onto a streetcar, a former student raised a pistol and fired 4 times. What she did next was a statement that would resonate for over a century. The woman was Voltairine de Cleyre. At 36 years old, she was one of the most respected, eloquent, and devoted figures in American anarchism. In an era of robber barons and political corruption, of violent labor strikes and swelling immigrant ghettos, she was a voice for a world without rulers, prisons, or police. She was a poet, an essayist, and a teacher, a woman whose slight frame and quiet intensity concealed a formidable intellect and an unbreakable will. The year 1902 was a perilous time to be an anarchist in America. Only 15 months had passed since President William McKinley was assassinated by a man, Leon Czolgosz, who claimed inspiration from the movement. The murder ignited a national firestorm. A wave of hysteria, worse than the one that followed the Haymarket affair 15 years earlier, swept the country. Anarchists were hunted, arrested, and beaten. Their meeting halls were raided, their newspapers wrecked by mobs. The press portrayed them as satanic monsters, and politicians demanded they be lynched, deported, or burned in oil. Voltairine de Cleyre stood firm against this tide of reaction. While she did not advocate for Czolgosz's act, she refused to condemn him. She argued that the true violence came not from the desperate assassin, but from the society that created him, a society of greed and exploitation, symbolized by McKinley himself. The hells of capitalism create the desperate, she wrote. The desperate act desperately. Her stance was principled, courageous, and deeply unpopular. It cemented her reputation as an unflinching radical, but it also placed her squarely in the crosshairs of public hatred and police suspicion. She lived a life of ascetic purpose, defined by what she called her dominant idea, the relentless pursuit of a free society. Born into poverty in a small Michigan town, educated in a Catholic convent that she described as the Valley of the Shadow of Death, she had forged her beliefs in the crucible of personal suffering. She earned a meager living in Philadelphia by teaching English to Jewish immigrants, working long hours in the city's crowded ghetto. Her life was a constant struggle against chronic illness and financial hardship. She was, in her own words, a worked-out body, a shriveled and withered soul, sustained only by her unwavering commitment to her cause. Her friends and comrades saw her as a secular saint, a priestess of pity and vengeance. She was also a pioneering feminist who saw traditional marriage as sex slavery and demanded total economic and sexual independence for women. She rejected the idea that any person could own another, a principle that would soon be tested in the most violent way imaginable. One of her former pupils was a young man named Herman Helcher, a Russian Jewish cigar maker. He was quiet, gentle, and intensely devoted to the anarchist cause. Like many of her students, he came to worship her. But in the years after his lessons, his admiration curdled into a dark and dangerous obsession. He was a man on the edge, his mind slowly unraveling, and he had come to believe that Voltairine de Cleyre, the woman he once revered, had ruined his life. But what transforms a devoted follower into a would-be killer? And how does a movement built on ideals of freedom handle a threat from within its own ranks? On the afternoon of December 19, Voltairine de Cleyre was walking to a student's home. It was a routine she followed nearly every day. The city was cold, the sky a flat winter gray. As she reached the corner of 4th and Green Streets, a streetcar rattled to a stop. She stepped from the curb, preparing to board. At that moment, a man pulled her sleeve. She turned. It was Herman Helcher. She had not seen him in 2 years. He had sent her a pitiful letter shortly before, speaking of having no food, no work, and no place to sleep, but she had not yet had time to find him. Now he stood before her, his face contorted. Before she could register what was happening, he raised a pistol. The deafening crack of the shots echoed between the brick buildings. The smell of gunpowder hung in the cold air. The first bullet struck her in the chest, just above the heart. The impact spun her around. Helcher fired again and again and again. One shot missed entirely. 2 more found their mark lodging in her back. Despite the shock and the searing pain, her will to live took over. She ran, bleeding, stumbling. She managed to cover half a block before collapsing on a stranger's doorstep. The street erupted into chaos. Helcher made no attempt to flee. He stood motionless, the revolver still in his hand, until a police officer arrested him. A crowd gathered around the fallen woman. By a stroke of fortune, another of her pupils, a doctor who lived nearby, heard the commotion and rushed to her side. He saw the gravity of her wounds and immediately called for an ambulance. As she was carried away on a stretcher, conscious but fading, she was taken to Hahnemann Hospital. The doctors who examined her believed her injuries were fatal. They did not expect her to survive the night. The bullets were lodged deep in her body, too close to vital organs to risk an operation. For several days, she hovered between life and death, but her constitution, though frail, proved resilient. As she later wrote to a friend, "Some way I settled down to the coldest kind of mental attitude in which the chief characteristic was unshakable determination not to die. Slowly, miraculously, her condition began to improve. The immediate danger passed. She had survived the bullets of her student. Now the world watched to see what she would do. Would she demand justice, or would she do something far more radical and far more dangerous to the established order?" The day after the shooting, detectives brought Herman Helcher to her hospital bedside for identification. Propped up on pillows, weak and in constant pain, she looked at the young man who had tried to kill her. She acknowledged that she knew him as a comrade and a former student, but when asked if he was the man who shot her, she refused to identify him. 2 days later, from her hospital bed, she dictated a statement to the Philadelphia North American. Her statement was an act of profound and astonishing empathy, a rejection of vengeance. "The boy who they say shot me is crazy," she began. "Lack of proper food and healthy labor made him so. He ought to be put into an asylum. It would be an outrage against civilization if he were sent to jail for an act which was the product of a diseased brain." She explained that his desperate letter had revealed his state of mind. He did not know what he was doing. He was simply a lunatic, acting as a man with a fever. I have no resentment towards the man. If society were so constituted as to allow every man, woman, and child to lead a normal life, there would be no violence in this world. It fills me with horror to think of the brutal acts done in the name of government. Every act of violence finds its echo in another act of violence. The policeman's club breeds criminals. She concluded with a defense of her own philosophy, a philosophy her attacker had claimed to share. Contrary to public understanding, anarchism means peace on earth, goodwill to men. Acts of violence done in the name of anarchy are caused by men and women who forget to be philosophers, teachers of the people, because their physical and mental sufferings drive them to desperation. This was the core of her dominant idea in action. She believed the modern world's obsession with punishment and revenge was a symptom of its moral bankruptcy. To her, true change required a revolution in thought. She saw Helcher not as a criminal to be punished, but as a victim to be healed. He was the fated fruit of the existing order. The true culprit was a system that bred poverty, illness, and despair. In her view, the state, with its prisons and police, was the primary author of violence. To ask that same state to punish her attacker would be a betrayal of everything she believed. It would be an admission that the official system of justice had some moral authority, a claim she had spent her life denying. She had faced the ultimate test of her principles and had not wavered. She had offered her attacker forgiveness and understanding. But in a world of police, prisons, and prosecutors, would an act of radical empathy have any power at all? De Cleyre's response stunned the public. In an atmosphere still thick with anti-anarchist rage, her act of forgiveness was incomprehensible to many. The Philadelphia press, which had long vilified her, was suddenly filled with grudging admiration. One reporter wrote that perhaps anarchism is really the doctrine of the Nazarene, the gospel of forgiveness. But her compassion did not sway the authorities. Helcher was charged with attempted murder. Voltairine refused to testify against him. Instead, she organized his defense. From her sickbed, she wrote an appeal to her comrades, asking them to raise money for his legal fees. What this poor, half-crazed boy needs is not the silence and cruelty of a prison, but the kindness, care, and sympathy which heal, she wrote. These have all been given to me, in unstinted quantity. Be as ready now to help the other who is perhaps the greater sufferer. Her friends and followers responded. A defense fund was created, and she worked tirelessly on his behalf. But the state was determined to make an example of him. Helcher was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 6 years and 9 months in prison. Medical examinations confirmed what de Cleyre had known intuitively. Helcher was suffering from paranoia or progressive insanity, a condition that had afflicted him since childhood. He was soon transferred from prison to the state asylum at Norristown. His mental state continued to deteriorate, and he died there a few years later. For Voltairine, the physical consequences of the attack were lifelong. The bullets remained in her body, a constant source of pain. The shooting aggravated her chronic sinus condition, which developed into a severe infection of the middle ear. For the rest of her life, she was afflicted with the relentless pounding in her head, a noise louder than the noise of the locomotive stationed within a few yards from her house. The pain and the incessant din would drive her to despair and, on at least one occasion, to another suicide attempt. The attack had shortened her life and condemned her remaining years to a state of near constant physical torment. Yet within 3 months of the shooting, she was back on the lecture platform. Before an audience of 1,200 people at Oddfellows Temple, she delivered a powerful address on crime and punishment. With Helcher's case clearly in her mind, she denounced the entire prison system as a savage and ineffective relic. "We have punished and punished for untold thousands of years," she declared, "and we have not gotten rid of crime, we have not diminished it. Prisons," she argued, "do not reform. They only fill men's hearts with bitterness, making them harder than when they went in. The only solution was to abolish the oppressive conditions that create criminals in the first place, and to treat offenders with enlightened medical care and compassion." Voltairine de Cleyre's defense of her own would-be assassin was the logical extension of a deeply held philosophy, a consistent application of anarchist principles to the most personal of crises. She was following the example of fellow anarchists like Louise Michel and Errico Malatesta, who had also refused to press charges after being shot. For them, to appeal to the state for protection or retribution was to validate the very institution they sought to abolish. The shooting of Voltairine de Cleyre became a defining moment in her story, an event that crystallized her legacy. It revealed the immense moral courage beneath her quiet exterior. She had looked into the face of violence and responded with a profound and challenging empathy. She forced a hostile public to confront the paradox of an anarchist who was more committed to the principle of non-retaliation than the society that condemned her. She would live for another decade, a decade of escalating pain and deepening melancholy, but also of tireless work for her cause. She would champion the Mexican Revolution, defend striking workers, and fight for free speech, her voice never losing its clarity or its conviction. But it was her response to Herman Helcher that most perfectly embodied her life's message. She believed that ideas were not merely topics for debate in lecture halls, they were guides for everyday life, principles to be lived, especially when the cost was highest. In her refusal to punish, she made her most powerful statement. She demonstrated that the rejection of authority must begin within oneself, with the rejection of the impulse for vengeance. She showed that the struggle for a new world was above all a moral struggle, demanding a revolution in the human heart. She died in 1912 at the age of 45, her body finally broken by a lifetime of illness and struggle. She was buried in Waldheim Cemetery, in the shadow of the monument to the Haymarket martyrs who had first inspired her. There she rests, a woman who, in the words of a friend, spent her tortured life in the service of an obscure cause. A woman who aimed for the stars, and whose life of radical principle continues to challenge our understanding of justice, forgiveness, and what it truly means to be free.